Hello, everybody. This is Howie Hawkins, and we have a special guest tonight, John Kiriakou, who is one of the significant whistleblowers, and we will get to that in a minute. I first have to report some sad news. Many of you met an activist here in Syracuse named Nikita Slade when we had her on this live stream, Angela and I, to talk about organizing. And we're really in shock here in Syracuse and around the movement because she died suddenly last week from a heart attack. She was only 32. And she's somebody who was active in our Syracuse Green Party here. She was on the staff of my 2014 campaign for New York governor. She was an advisor on policing and racial justice issues for our presidential campaign. And she was a key leader in Black Lives Matter Syracuse. And she also did a Queer Women of Color podcast that was one of Angela's favorites. She was a union millwright, but to me, she was the best activist I have met from her generation. She was one of the most well-read activists of any generation. I had many conversations with her on social theory and organizing, and she'd read a lot of books that I haven't found anybody else to talk to about. So I'm going to miss her for those conversations as much as her energy and commitment to the movement. And we were blessed for the contributions she made while she was with us. And we're just so sad that she's departed, and she had a lot more to give. So, that's the sad news. And Angela and I wrote a little remembrance on the website. If you go there under the updates, you can read about it. There's some pictures. There's links to the interviews. I did an interview with her after a Black Lives Matter demonstration here in Syracuse. And you'll see how much she was giving, and it's, how sad it is that she's not with us anymore. So that's just sad news to report. So what we want to talk about tonight is the war on whistleblowers. And I'm wearing my Ralph Nader t-shirt from 08, if you can see that. Ralph coined the term whistleblowers as we understand it today. He had a big conference and a book, trying to promote people in government and in the corporate sector to release information that ought to be in the public domain, in the public interest. And he had a big impact. That became part of the ethic of people that wanted to, do good. And eventually one of the last piece of legislation he was able to help shepherd through Congress was the Whistleblowers Protection Act in 1989, although that has been weakened by court decisions, particularly with respect to people releasing information that's in the national security realm. So most of the war on whistleblowers that we're familiar with now are people charged under the Espionage Act, except they're not doing espionage. They're releasing information that they think the public ought to know. But the Espionage Act was enacted in 1917 during World War I to go after the anti-war movement. And one of the really debilitating repressive features of it is if you release information, you can't defend it as in the public interest. That's not permitted under the statute, which makes whistleblowers who are charged for espionage, which they're not working for any foreign government, that puts them in a real bind. And so back in around World War I, they charged the anti-war radicals. Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, the anarchists, were deported to Russia. 3 socialists were charged under it. One was a member of Congress, Victor Berger. Another was A. Philip Randolph, who we know as a civil rights leader later in the century. And then Eugene Debs, who was actually sentenced to 10 years for an anti-war speech he gave in Canton, Ohio. I wrote a remembrance of that on the anniversary, I think last year. He ended up spending 3 years in jail. And then he was pardoned by President Harding, who invited him to the White House. Very different than the treatment our whistleblowers are getting today. Harding took the place of Wilson. It was rarely used for the rest of the century, a couple espionage cases. The most notable is the Rosenberg's case. And while Julius may have been giving atomic information to the Russians, it seems the evidence shows that his wife Ethel was not, but she was executed as well. But then it was used for the first time against whistleblowers by Richard Nixon, going against Daniel Ellsberg and Anthony Russo for releasing the Pentagon Papers. And they were not convicted because of FBI misconduct. And then it lay dormant again until the administration of Barack Obama. And he went after 8 different people for leaking information, mostly about our military and intelligence operations. And you've heard of some of these people: Chelsea Manning, who released all those informations, including that infamous collateral murder video, which showed this guy in a helicopter gunship killing civilians, asking for permission, seemed to be, excited about it. Reminded me of the first Vietnam vet I talked to back in 1964. He's the older brother of a Little League teammate who was bragging about how he was just killing random people from his helicopter in Vietnam. And that massacre not only killed civilians, it killed some Reuters journalists. And so Chelsea, has spent time in prison for that. They've still, asked her to do more, and she's spent more time in prison. In that same first group of 8 under Obama, Edward Snowden is probably the best known. He's somebody, his book on, what do you call it? I forget the name. Came out in 2019. It was the most impactful book I read that year. And I was saying during the campaign, I would drop the charges and bring him into the administration because I felt he had the right values. He was for democracy against authoritarianism and had a handle on how to do, proper intelligence without violating people's constitutional rights. And, if I was president, I would need somebody who knew how to do that. And then another one is our guest tonight, John Kiriakou, who revealed to journalists information about the CIA's torture program during the early 2000s. And then Trump continued. Obama administration declined to prosecute Julian Assange. Trump has gone ahead, and Biden has continued. And there are a number of other cases going on right now that we'll probably talk about tonight, like Daniel Hale. And then the last thing I want to say before I bring on John Kiriakou is that it's not only the Espionage Act. We have a case with Stephen Donziger. He had a trial open up yesterday. And this is a man who worked with 30,000 farmers and indigenous people in Ecuador and won a $9.5 or $8.5 billion in damages from Chevron for environmental and health damages in Ecuador in 2011. And right away, Chevron sued in this country, and they charged him with things like saying he extorted and bribed and so forth the process in Ecuador. And so by 2014, he didn't get a jury trial. He just had a judge rule that the Ecuadorian ruling should be vacated and fine Donziger $800,000. And then in the appeal, the judge asked for, his phone and computer and whatnot, which Donziger said that's attorney-client privilege. So they charged him with contempt of court, which led to his disbarment and house arrest. Now, in March this year, the Circuit Court of Appeals vacated some of the sanctions against Donziger, included house arrest because of this contempt of court charge. So that went to trial yesterday, and already a couple of the Chevron lawyers have dropped out because in cross-examination, the lies they've been giving would be exposed. That's what the theory is. So now and the prosecution is being done by a private prosecutor because the Southern District of New York, the U.S. Attorney, said there's not a case and refused to prosecute. So there's a lot of shady stuff going on here. And progressive Democrats just sent a letter to Mayor Garland to look into this case. It's got a lot of attention. People are wondering where Barack Obama is. He went to law school with Stephen Donziger. They played basketball together. Obama's been silent. Ralph Nader had a podcast that's worth listening, I think in late March, with Stephen Donziger. But you can see what the issue is here. He won a big judgment against the corporation, and they went to the U.S. courts, which acted like their lackeys and basically took this man's life from him. And, you know, he's fighting to get it back in court, and it's a case we should all be following. So that's what we're talking about with whistleblowers. It's really difficult to be a whistleblower. You put your whole life on the line. And that book by Ed Snowden is Permanent Record. So I had forgot that. So let's bring John Kiriakou on, and he can talk about his experience as a whistleblower, and he knows a lot of these whistleblowers. Mm-hmm. We haven't named all of them, but we'll get to them as we go through this discussion. So welcome, John.
Thank you, Howie. Thanks very much for having me. And hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. I've got a story to tell you, and I'll tell the story, and I'd love to take whatever questions you might have. So I spent 15 years at the CIA. The first half of my career was in analysis, just sort of sitting at a desk, thinking the big thoughts, writing papers that nobody would read. And I got bored with that, and I made a very unusual transfer into counterterrorism operations. As it turned out, I was the only person in the entire CIA who was fluent in both Greek and Arabic. And they made a determination that it was a lot easier to teach a linguist operations than it was to take an operations person and teach him how to speak Greek and Arabic. So I went into counterterrorism operations in 1997. And in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, I was named the chief of counterterrorism for the CIA in Pakistan. So in that position, high stress, dangerous position, I led a series of raids in March of 2002 that resulted in the capture of, well, I'm not allowed to say the actual number still, but it was many dozens of Al-Qaeda fighters, including one by the name of Abu Zubaydah, who we believed at the time was the number 3 in Al-Qaeda. He was not the number 3. He was actually never even a member of Al-Qaeda. He was certainly a bad guy. He assisted Al-Qaeda in terms of logistics. You know, if you were tired of the fight and you wanted a ticket home, Abu Zubaydah would get it for you. Abu Zubaydah created and ran the 2 Al-Qaeda training camps in southern Afghanistan. He formed the what was called the House of Martyrs safe house in Peshawar, Pakistan. So bad guy, but not a member of Al-Qaeda, and certainly not the number 3 in Al-Qaeda. But on the night of March 22nd, 2002, we caught him. And a Pakistani policeman shot him 3 times with an AK-47 in the thigh, the groin, and the stomach. And he was very severely wounded. My orders were to sit next to his bed 24/7. George Tenet told me 24/7 CIA eyes on. He said, do not leave his bedside. And so I sat there. 24 hours after we caught him, Abu Zubaydah came out of his coma. And the first thing he said to me was, he asked me to kill him. He asked me to take a pillow and smother him. And I said, oh no, Abu Zubaydah, we've been looking for you for a long time. Nobody's going to kill you. In fact, I said, you're going to get the best medical care that the American government could provide. He cried a lot. He said that he would never know the touch of a woman. He would never know the joy of fatherhood. And we talked a lot about religion. He recited poetry. He asked if I would pass a message to his mother. And finally, I said, listen, I'm going to give you some advice. I am the nicest guy that you're going to meet in this experience. My colleagues are not nice like I am. So if there's one thing that you do, it's that you have to cooperate. There were 50,000 people in those towers that morning. I said, you're not the victim here. And he said to me, you seem like a nice man, but you're the enemy, and I'll never cooperate. So altogether 56 hours passed. I was with him for 56 hours. And a CIA plane flew in to pick him up and take him to what turned out to be a secret prison that none of us knew about. We didn't have a need to know, and we weren't read into the compartment. So he asked me to hold his hand. 3 FBI agents and I carried him out to the plane on a gurney, and we tied him across the luggage rack at the back of the plane. And I leaned over and I said, remember, you have to cooperate. Good luck, I told him, and I squeezed his hand. Never saw him again. 3 months later, I've returned to CIA headquarters. And certainly Abu Zubaydah was not cooperating. But I was in the cafeteria one day, standing in line to get lunch, and a senior officer from the CIA's Counterterrorism Center stopped me and said, hey, very casually, hey, I'm glad I ran into you. Do you want to be certified in the use of enhanced interrogation techniques? I had never heard that term before. This was May the 6th, 2002. I still remember the date. So I said, enhanced interrogation techniques. What does that mean? And very excitedly, he said, we're going to start getting rough with these guys. And I said, well, what exactly does that mean? And so he explained to me these different techniques. And I said, man, that sounds like a torture program. I've got a moral and ethical problem with that, besides the fact that torture is illegal. The fact of the matter is, we have something in this country called the Federal Torture Act of 1946, which specifically outlaws exactly those techniques that we used against Al-Qaeda prisoners. Besides that, we were signatories to and the drafters of the United Nations Convention Against Torture. Now, in 1946, we executed Japanese soldiers who waterboarded American POWs. That was a death penalty crime to waterboard somebody. In 1968, January 11th, 1968, the Washington Post ran a front page photograph of an American soldier waterboarding a North Vietnamese prisoner. On the day that that photo appeared, Secretary of Defense McNamara ordered an investigation. The soldier was arrested. He was charged with torture, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Well, the law never changed. We changed. So something that was a death penalty offense in 1946, something that called for 20 years in prison in 1968, was not just okay by 2002. It was actively encouraged and supported by both the Justice Department and the White House, and then carried out by the Central Intelligence Agency. I said this was illegal, it was immoral, and it was unethical, and I wanted no part of it. On August 1st, 2002, the CIA began to torture Abu Zubaydah, and they began with the technique of waterboarding, which was one of the harshest techniques that they had. Certainly, there were people inside the CIA who objected to this, but the key phrase here is inside the CIA. Nobody said anything publicly, nothing, not a word. I was promoted at the time because I had caught Abu Zubaydah, and so I became the executive assistant to the CIA's deputy director for operations. And in that capacity, I saw literally every cable that was coming into the CIA from around the world. And so I was reading the reporting coming back from the secret site where Abu Zubaydah had been taken. And CIA officers went far beyond what had been authorized by the Justice Department. There were a couple of techniques that they were using that I believed at the time and still to this day that were worse than waterboarding. One was sleep deprivation. Now, sleep deprivation sounds like no big deal, right? They keep you awake. But it's not that simple. What they do is they chain you to an eye bolt in the ceiling so you can't sit or kneel or lay or get comfortable in any way. They have industrial power lights on you 24 hours a day, and they're blasting music over and over and over, the same song over and over again, 24 hours a day. Now, we know from the American Psychological Association, the APA, which has done studies on these kinds of things, that people begin to lose their minds around day 7 with no sleep. They begin to die around day 9, and that's because your organs begin to shut down from lack of sleep. The CIA, though, was authorized to keep prisoners awake for up to 12 days. Now, we killed people with that technique of sleep deprivation. There was nothing in the Justice Department's opinion that said we could murder people, but they did it anyway. The other one was called the cold cell. The cold cell was an absolutely horrible thing. They chain you to that eye bolt in the ceiling again. They chill your cell to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. They strip you naked. And then every hour, a CIA officer goes into your cell and throws a bucket of ice water on you. We killed 2 more prisoners with that technique. So this was ongoing. And at the same time, the CIA was collecting literally no intelligence from any of these prisoners. You know, certainly they were babbling on about whatever it was they thought the CIA wanted to hear just to get them to stop the torture. But they were not able, the analysts and the collectors were not able to collect any actionable intelligence at all, nothing. I resigned from the CIA in early 2004. And I was waiting for somebody to say something because I just assumed that, you know, this was so heinous. And there were certainly other people inside the agency that were opposed to it. I just expected somebody to come out and say something. Nobody said a word. Finally, in December of 2007, 5.5 years after I got home from Pakistan, and more than 5 years after we started torturing Abu Zubaydah, I got a call from Brian Ross at ABC News. And he said that someone had told him, a source had told him, that I had tortured Abu Zubaydah. I said that was absolutely untrue. I was the only person who was kind to Abu Zubaydah. I have never raised a hand to a prisoner in my life. I said, your source is either mistaken or he's lying. And I came to the conclusion later that the source was lying because it turned out the source was at the White House. So I decided that now was the time to come clean, that the American people owned this information. The American people had a right to know what their government was doing in their name, besides the fact that it is illegal, it is a felony to classify a crime. And what I mean by that is, if you are doing something that is a crime, whether in the United States or under international law, it is illegal to make that operation classified. By definition, because it's a crime, it has to remain unclassified. And so on December 11th, 2007, I gave a nationally broadcast interview with Brian Ross at ABC News, and I said 3 things that just changed the course of the rest of my life. I said that the CIA was torturing its prisoners. I said that torture was official U.S. government policy. It was not the result of a rogue CIA officer, as President Bush had said, disingenuously. And I said that the torture program had been personally approved by the president himself. As you might imagine, within 24 hours, the CIA reported me to the FBI. They filed something called a crimes report, saying that I had leaked classified information to the media. The FBI investigated me for a full year from December of 2007 until December of 2008. And then they sent my attorneys something called a declination letter, declining to prosecute me. They said that I had not violated the law. 4 weeks later, Barack Obama becomes president, and he appoints John Brennan, an old nemesis of mine, to be the Deputy National Security Advisor for counterterrorism. I had no idea that John Brennan secretly asked the Justice Department to reopen the case against me. And so for the next 3 years, my phones were tapped, my emails were intercepted, and teams of FBI agents followed me, not all the time, but followed me periodically wherever, to the grocery store, to church, to a restaurant with my family. They followed me to my mom's sister's funeral in Ohio. I actually didn't know it was them. And I reported it to the FBI thinking maybe it's a terrorist, maybe it's a criminal, who knows? Here it was the FBI, and I reported it to the FBI. So in January 2012, this all came to a head. And I was arrested and charged with 5 felonies, including 3 counts of espionage. Now, as Howie pointed out, espionage is one of the gravest crimes with which an American can be charged. And in many cases, it carries with it the death penalty. I knew in my heart I hadn't committed espionage. Talking to ABC News, or really talking to the American people via ABC News, is not espionage. And so I hired a team of A-list, nationally known national security attorneys here in Washington, and we decided we were going to fight. Now, let's talk about that Espionage Act for a minute. Howie mentioned that the Espionage Act was written and passed into law in 1917. The stated purpose at the time was to combat German saboteurs during the First World War. It was never used against German saboteurs. It was used against progressives and anti-war activists. But between 1917 and 2009, the Espionage Act was used to prosecute 3 people who had spoken to the media, right? Now, as Howie mentioned correctly, that it was used against other political opponents of whatever president happened to be in office. But 3 people were prosecuted for speaking to the media. Just under Barack Obama, 8 Americans were charged with espionage for speaking to the media. Barack Obama had what I would describe as a Nixonian obsession with leaks. The New York Times said that the point of my prosecution was not even really to prosecute me. It was not even really to punish me. It was to frighten every other person in the national security apparatus from going to the public, from going to the press to discuss waste, fraud, abuse, illegality, or threats to the public health or public safety, which is the definition of whistleblowing, the legal definition. And certainly Scott Shane at the New York Times told me that on the day of my arrest, every single one of the New York Times national security sources went silent and stayed silent. It's kind of a long story, but I'm going to skip a lot of it, and we could talk about it in the questions and answers. What ended up happening was this. I was facing 45 years in prison. In my first meeting with the Justice Department, that's what they offered me, 45 years. And one of the Justice Department's lawyers said, "Take the plea, Mr. Kiriakou, and you may live to meet your grandchildren." I said, "I'm not doing 45 minutes. Later on, they came down to 10 years on a Monday. 10 years, they said. Take a guilty plea to espionage and do 10 years. I said, I didn't commit espionage, and I haven't done anything to be ashamed of. On Wednesday, 2 days later, they came down to 8 years. And then on Friday, they came down to 5 years. My lead attorney was a giant by the name of Plato Kacharis. And Plato said, these were his exact words, I've been a practicing attorney in Washington for 52 years. And he said, I've never seen them come down in time. He said, usually they'll offer you 10. If you turn it down, they offer you 15. If you turn it down, they offer you 18. And I said, well, why are they coming down in time with me? And very quickly he said, because they have a shit case and they know it's shit. So I said, well, what do? He said, we fight and we go to trial. You didn't do anything wrong. The truth of the matter is, according to ProPublica, which did a study published in November of 2012, the federal government wins 98.2% of its cases. Almost all of those are a result of two techniques that the Justice Department uses. One is called charge stacking, and the other is venue shopping. Now, venue shopping is easy. They charge you in the federal district where you are most likely to be convicted and where you are most likely to get a long sentence. That's why I was charged in the Eastern District of Virginia. It's called the Espionage Court because no national security defendant has ever won a case there. That's where they charged Jeffrey Sterling. That's where they charged Chelsea Manning. That's where they charged, well, Chelsea Manning was military, but her contempt was Eastern District. That's where they charged Ed Snowden and Julian Assange. The other one I said is charge stacking. So what they'll do is they'll charge you, let's say maybe you did do something wrong, but they won't charge you with one crime. They'll charge you with 10, 20 felonies, and they'll wait until you go bankrupt. And then they'll come and say, all right, listen, we'll drop all the charges if you plead guilty to one felony. Well, what are you going to do? I had 5 kids at home. I knew that they won 98.2% of their cases. I was facing 45 years in prison. They're offering me now their best and final offer was 2.5 years. I do 23 months. So I hired O.J. Simpson's jury consultant, who happened to be the uncle of my best friend's wife. No, Eastern District of Virginia is in Alexandria, Virginia, in response to one of the questions. So I hired the jury consultant, and he came up and we got him a security clearance because all my lawyers had to be cleared. He went through all 15,000 pages of discovery. And then we all met in this big conference room. And he said, if we were in any other district in America, we would win this thing. He said, but the Eastern District of Virginia, your jury is going to be made up of people from the FBI, the CIA, the Pentagon, intelligence community contractors, and their family members. He said, you don't have a prayer. Just take the deal. The night before I had to give the Justice Department an answer, my wife and I stayed up all night long. I was only the second American ever charged with violating the Intelligence Identities Protection Act of 1981. And so we went over, there was no case law, but there were several law review journals from Harvard Law School. And we concluded that I just hadn't done anything wrong. I hadn't broken the law. And so I emailed my attorneys at 6 o'clock in the morning and I said, I've been thinking about it all night and I decided I want to go to trial, thinking stupidly that once I got in front of a jury, they would see how ridiculous this was. They would see that it was political. They would see that I had done a public service. And my lawyers called me and said, or one of them called me and said, put on a pot of coffee. We're on the way over. They came over to my house. They told me, you can't turn this down. You have to take the deal. If you're convicted, you're seriously looking at 12 to 18 years. Just take the deal. I still didn't want to take the deal. And then one of the attorneys, the one who I liked and respected the most, pulled me aside and said, listen, this can be a blip in your life, or it can be the defining event in your life. Make it the blip. And so I took the deal. It's funny that the deal, the case itself, made me far better known than I ever would have been before. I mean, when I blew the whistle on the torture program, it was a story for a few days, a week, but my prosecution made me a martyr for human rights. it gave me a venue, a soapbox with which I could speak to the American people. I'm on TV all the time, thanks to these idiots at the Justice Department. Otherwise, nobody would even remember that there was a guy who said anything about the torture program. I was very pleased one day when I was sitting in prison. It was December of 2014, and I was reading a 4-day-old copy of the New York Times. They would, of course, go through my New York Times and cut out articles that they didn't want me to read. But there was an interview in there with Ed Snowden. And Ed said that he had watched my case and he had watched Tom Drake's case, Tom Drake, the NSA whistleblower. And neither one of us backed down, despite the enormous pressure that we were under. And so we had inspired him to go public with his revelations. And I got to tell you, that and one other thing that also happened in December of 14 made it all worthwhile. The other thing was, I'm sitting there in my cell one day, and a guy walks in and says, "Hey, buddy, you're on TV." I said, "Oh, okay." I got up, I walked over to the TV, and it was John McCain standing on the floor of the Senate saying that without my revelations, the American people would never have known that there was a torture program and that they were torturing people in the name of the American people. He said, even though I was in prison, that I deserved the thanks of the American public, and he was happy to do that from the floor of the Senate. That completely changed the way that I saw myself. CNN, until the day before I went to prison, called me CIA leaker John Kiriakou. They changed it to CIA torture whistleblower John Kiriakou the day before I went to prison. Fox, for whatever odd reason, probably because I was prosecuted by Obama, always called me CIA torture whistleblower John Kiriakou. MSNBC, which was, pretty much the Obama network, called me CIA leaker John Kiriakou, or John Kiriakou, who styles himself a whistleblower, which still makes me angry to this day. But, this is just the way it is. Now, what's happened since I got out of prison in February of 2015 is all of us Obama-era whistleblowers have sort of banded together, along with some absolutely amazing attorneys like Jesselyn Radak, for example, formerly of the Government Accountability Project, now of what's called the WHISPER program, the Whistleblower and Source Protection Program. Tom Drake, Ed Snowden, the godfather of whistleblowing, the great, heroic Daniel Ellsberg. There are a bunch of us, and we're like brothers and sisters. And what we do now, and I'm happy to do it, and I do it several times a week, is to advise other would-be whistleblowers so that they don't make the same mistakes that I made, or the same mistakes that my other whistleblowing colleagues have made. The truth has to get out there, and this is one thing about the truth, is it always eventually sees the light, right? You can't keep the truth under wraps. You can't trick the American people over the long term. It's just not possible. And so I'm happy to be a part of helping people get their truth out there. Remember, there's a legal definition of whistleblowing: bringing to light any evidence of waste, fraud, abuse, illegality, or threats to the public health or public safety. I'm going to close by saying one thing. At the CIA, the culture is such that they always taught us that everything in life is a shade of gray. That is not true. Some things are black and white. Some things are right and wrong. When I stood on my first day at the CIA with my hand in the air, and I swore an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States and to protect it against all enemies, foreign and domestic, I meant it. I'm sorry to say that of the 300 people in the room that day, it appears that I was the only one who meant it, but I meant it. And so government is better when government is honest. Government is better when it's transparent. We're right and they're wrong, and we have to make them pay when they violate the law. So thank you very much. I kept it to 30 minutes, just like I promised, Howie. And I am happy to take whatever questions you might have for me. Oh, we can't hear you, Howie.
I said, thank you, John. I think a lot of people hearing the details and the sequence just brings it home.
Oh, thank you.
You know, because most people, they maybe read something in the press and, you know, when you string it together, you realize how oppressive the government is toward people that tell us what's going on that we ought to know about.
Yeah.
And that is a huge problem. I mean, it reminds me, we call ourselves a democracy. It reminds me of what Gandhi said when he was asked about Western civilization. He said it would be a good idea. And we have a lot of things to correct.
Yes, we do indeed.
So I've seen some questions in the chat. There we go. So Santino Musto, my question to John, did it rattle your nerves and or mentally scar you seeing people being tortured and murdered? Did this have anything to do with you deciding to become a whistleblower? That's
a really good question. You know, it's funny. I've been answering these questions for, 14 years, and nobody's ever asked me that. The easy answer is yes, it did scar me. When I came home from Pakistan, well, let me back up. I've got a friend who I worked with in the CIA. We go to the same church, and he just happens to be a former brigadier general, and he's also a psychiatrist. And he mentioned something to me about a year ago that it just had never crossed my mind. I said, I was a star at the agency until I left. And he said, that's not true. They turned on you in 2002. I said, what are you talking about? I was a star in 2002. I went up to the 7th floor. I was the executive assistant. And he said, don't you remember they used to call you the human rights guy? I said, yes. He said, that wasn't a compliment. They were talking about you behind your back because you weren't willing to torture anybody or to kill anybody. And another truth of that time, and I kept this to myself, was I came back from Pakistan with PTSD. I was surprised at how willing my colleagues were to kill people. These are guys that I used to get together with on the weekends. We'd have a barbecue. Our kids would play together. Our wives were friends. And then they would go on their week-long missions and kill people and come back. There was one guy that I worked with. I sat 20 feet away from him in the CIA's counterterrorism center. And every morning I'd say, hey, man, how you doing? And every morning he'd say, hey, buddy, how you doing? I was never really clear on exactly what he did in the office. We don't have like name tags or anything with your job description, right? So I asked a colleague, I said, I'm unclear exactly what he does here. He travels an awful lot. And my friend said, John, he works for the Special Activities Division. What do you think they do? And I thought, wow, you know what? I hadn't thought of that. Because he's such a nice guy, he's so easygoing, he brings bagels in on Fridays and coffee, and he was an assassin. And when public opinion polls show that the American people are in solid support of the CIA and other intelligence agencies, killing people who they believe might, perhaps, maybe someday pose a threat to the United States. I mean, where do you go from there? You're really crying in the darkness. But yes, to answer Santino's question, yeah, that was not my thing. It bothered me very much. I'll add one other thing. A CIA psychiatrist, a different one, once told me that the CIA actively seeks to hire people who have sociopathic tendencies, not sociopaths. Sociopaths are impossible to control because they don't have a conscience. They blow right through the polygraph exam, but you just can't control them because they're unable to feel remorse or regret. But as you might imagine, sociopaths slip through the process. because they can't feel remorse, because they don't react on a polygraph. Well, just like in corporate America, those same sociopaths rise to the very top of the CIA's leadership. And that's why we've got assassination squads. And that's why we have teams of people who overthrow governments or who do international kidnapping. You know, that's why we need robust congressional oversight, which we haven't had since the 70s, frankly. Good question. Thank you, Santino.
Jason Justice asks, hi, John, do you know how many publicly known, quote, intelligence agencies there are? Follow up, why do we need so many when they seem to be asleep at the switch and promoters of U.S. imperialism?
Yes, you're absolutely right in every aspect of that question, Jason. First of all, there are no secret intelligence services anymore. Not since NSA finally went public. The CIA, of course, was secret in the beginning. NSA was secret like into the late 70s. But what you see is what you get. I think it's like 19 of them. Now, some are still so secret that we don't really know what they do, like DARPA, for example, at the Pentagon. We know that they develop futuristic weapon systems and stuff like that. But beyond that, we don't really know what goes on inside DARPA. Why do we need so many of them? We don't. We don't. This is empire building on the part of different components of the U.S. government, primarily the Pentagon. Like the Pentagon is in ultimate charge of most intelligence agencies. So why do we need Army intelligence, Navy intelligence, Marine Corps intelligence, Air Force intelligence, DIA, NSA belongs to the Pentagon. Why do we need all those? They're duplicative. They all do the same thing. And then they try to one-up each other and better each other. All the while, the CIA is making fun of them about how terrible they are and how amateurish. But the final part of your question is they seem to be asleep at the switch and promoters of U.S. imperialism. Yes, you're exactly right. They are asleep at the switch. And listen, I'm telling you from firsthand experience, the CIA, which is supposed to be the quote unquote best and brightest, has missed literally every major international development since the creation of the CIA in 1947. They missed everything from the building of the Berlin Wall to the fall of the Berlin Wall and everything in between. They blew the collapse of the Soviet Union. They blew the collapse of the Shah's regime in Iran. The Directorate of Operations completely blew democracy in Iran by overthrowing Prime Minister Mossadegh on behalf of British Petroleum, BP. Seriously. Kermit Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's son, who was in charge of that operation for the CIA, later said that it was the gravest mistake he had made in his life. My dear friend and attorney, Bruce Fine, he's one of the most important constitutional scholars in America, has been talking about writing a book about the CIA's analytic failures. We all know about their operational failures. They're terrible operationally. But the analytic failures are even more dangerous, or have been more dangerous through history, because it's that analysis that our policymakers rely on to make foreign policy. And frequently, the CIA has been so wrong that foreign policy has been a disaster. So excellent question. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I would just add that there was a book came out several years ago by William Arkin and Dana Priest called Top Secret America.
Yes, fantastic.
Really an expose in the Washington Post. And it describes the Department of Homeland Security and the intelligence agencies have become like the military industrial complex, an intelligence industrial complex.
Yes. Building
bureaucracies. They got so much money, they're spending it, before the end of the year so they can get, refunded. And there's a lot of waste. And while they're playing with all this money, they're not collecting intelligence that we need.
Let me ask you a question, and this is not a rhetorical question. Why does the Department of Agriculture need an intelligence agency? Why does the Department of Commerce need a fully staffed intelligence agency? What possible intelligence could they be collecting or analyzing or contributing to? It doesn't make any sense to me. You know, it's like the Department of Education has an armed police unit that also collects intelligence. It's the Department of Education. Although they're not members of the I, capital C intelligence community, why do they even call themselves intelligence? This doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, that reminds me of another book came out in the 80s about, they called it guard labor. 1/4 of the workforce, security guards, police, the intelligence apparatus, is watching the other 3/4 of us.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an enormous waste and really not in the public interest.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's right. You know, Ed Snowden, we wouldn't have any idea really the extent to which NSA spies on us if it hadn't been for Ed Snowden. I think he's a bona fide American hero. I really do. And let's think about this for a second, what NSA does. First of all, NSA was not created by an act of Congress. It was just arbitrarily created by the Pentagon and just foisted upon us. The Pentagon denied its existence until 1978. And now what they do, despite the fact that in NSA's charter, they are prohibited from collecting information on what are called U.S. persons. That's a U.S. citizen or any person in the country on a green card, a permanent resident alien. That's all they do now, right? They have access to every phone call, every email, every text message that every American sends and receives every single day. And they have enough space, memory at this new facility that they just finished building in Utah to collect information from every American for the next 500 years. That's not what they should be doing. They should be collecting overseas to protect us. We are not the enemy here, but that's what it's come down to. I see Rob Rich has a question about Julian Assange. I'm proud to say that I'm on the Julian Assange Defense Advisory Committee. And Julian is suffering mightily right now. But I think actually that he has the upper hand in that the Justice Department has to prove to the British Supreme Court that the way the U.S. practices solitary confinement is not a form of torture. Now, the reason why that's going to be impossible is that the United Nations has already declared it to be a form of torture, and 2 other British courts have blocked extraditions to the United States of prisoners who would be subject to solitary confinement here because it's a form of torture. So there are 3 separate precedents that are serving right now to protect Julian Assange. Now, the British are being jerks about it, and they won't let him out of Belmarsh prison pending this appeal. But honestly, I don't see how the U.S. can win this appeal. They're going to have to let Julian go.
let's hope so.
Let's hope so.
Z. Kramer, do you think it is realistic to remove the institution of the CIA?
Thank you for that. The answer is yes, and I'll tell you why. I mentioned a few minutes ago that much intelligence work is duplicative. In the CIA's case, that's especially true. The CIA's Directorate of Intelligence does analysis. Well, literally the same analysis is done by the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, INR. The Directorate of Operations at the CIA collects human source intelligence. Human source intelligence is also collected by the Defense Department's Defense Human Services, DHS. The CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology develops new weapons, new systems, new ways of interception, just as both NSA and DARPA do. So literally everything that the CIA does is also done somewhere else in government. And at least in the case of the State Department and DARPA, it's done better than it's done at the CIA. The CIA, in my view, has become a rogue organization, especially after 9/11. And Congress just is unwilling or unable to exercise legitimate oversight. And so I really don't believe that we need a CIA. It doesn't contribute anything to the national security. It hasn't saved us from anything, protected us from anything. I mean, it was the CIA's failure that we had 9/11 in the first place. So no, I don't think that we need to have a CIA.
Deborah Sousa Oliveira. John,
Yeah.
what can Americans do to protect whistleblowers?
What a great question that is. And it's hard. The answer is difficult. It's something that's going to take a long time. And what we have to do is to ride our elected officials to not just, come out in support of whistleblowers, but the laws need to be changed. Howie mentioned in his introduction, or maybe you didn't, maybe Howie, before we started, we were talking about it. And that's the fact that whistleblowers are not permitted to present an affirmative defense. I talked to Ed Snowden a few months ago, and we were talking about the possibility of him coming home. And he said that he's willing to come home and he's willing to go to prison, right? If he can get up in court and explain to the judge and to the American people why he did what he did. That's called an affirmative defense. Yes, I did it, but I did it for this reason. Well, the Espionage Act does not allow an affirmative defense. And in my own case, my judge said, not in a million years could I get up and explain why I did what I did, because the affirmation is irrelevant. So what we need to do is we need to very seriously amend. And you know what? I take that back. Not amend. We need to scrap the Espionage Act, and we need to start fresh again. The Espionage Act is so old that it doesn't even mention classified information. Why? Because it was written 40 years before the classification system was even invented. It mentions only national defense information, and then it doesn't identify what national defense information is. It doesn't define it. And so it's up to each individual judge in each individual federal district to define what national defense information is. Well, how's that just? How is that fair? So that's what we need to do, is to really ride our elected officials. Now, I'm not stupid. I know that there's no member of Congress who's going to say, oh, you know what I should do to really win lots of new votes? I should make it more difficult to charge someone with espionage. But, let's be adults here and grab the bull by the horns. That's exactly what needs to be done. The whole law needs to be scrapped and rewritten.
And not be used against people that aren't doing espionage.
That's right. Listen, the Espionage Act should be used to prosecute people who commit espionage against the United States. If you're working for a foreign government, China, Russia, Cuba, Israel, whatever, then you should be charged and prosecuted under the Espionage Act. But whistleblowers? No. Eugene Debs, because he was against the war? No, that's not what it was meant to be. Or that's not what it was supposed to be anyway.
Diana M, 16. John, do you see Gitmo ever being closed?
Talk about cowardice, huh? I'll tell you a quick story, Diane. When I caught my first group of prisoners, it was in January of 2002, and we locked them up temporarily in the Rawalpindi jail, just because it happened to be the nearest jail to us. And I called CIA headquarters, Counterterrorism Center, and I said, listen, I caught 4 guys. I don't know what to do with them. And they said, oh, we're going to fly in a C-12. Just put them on the C-12. I said, oh, you're going to take them back to the U.S. for prosecution? They said, no, we're going to send them to Guantanamo. And I said, Guantanamo, Cuba? Yeah. I said, why would you send them to Guantanamo, Cuba? And the response was fascinating. The response was, we're going to use Guantanamo as a clearinghouse so that we can charge them in the federal districts in Washington, D.C. and the Eastern District of Virginia, the Southern and Eastern Districts of New York, and the Eastern District of Massachusetts, right? So this is where the crimes were committed. They're only going to be in Guantanamo for a matter of weeks until we can figure out which district to send them to for their trial. And I said, oh, that's a great idea. Well, nobody ever came to the United States for trial. Almost nobody was even charged with a crime. You saw how the Republicans completely flipped out like crazy people when Obama said during the 2008 campaign that he wanted to shut Guantanamo down. And in fact, they passed a law over his veto threat that prohibit the president of the United States from closing down Guantanamo. There was an article in today's Washington Post saying that the last minor prisoner is being released from Guantanamo. He's an Afghan. That leaves only one Afghan left at Guantanamo. He's one of 70 people. And at its height, it had something like 789 people, 70 people. Well, some of them are, truly bad guys, like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11. But my God, even Khalid Sheikh Mohammed has constitutional rights. So either charge him with a crime or let him go. Same with Abu Zubaydah, same with Ramzi bin Ashib, same with all these guys. If you're not going to charge them with a crime, you have to let them go. They have the same right that you and I have to face our accusers in a court of law, to face a jury of their peers. And if we're not going to allow them to do that, then they have to be released. With that said, I don't see Guantanamo closing down until either two things happen. These prisoners eventually die. And, that happens with some frequency, usually by suicide. Or somehow the government is able to charge them in a civilian court. But the reason that hasn't happened yet is because the CIA tortured them all. And because they were tortured, literally nothing that they said can be used against them. And without their own admissions, then there's just nothing to hold them on. It's a quagmire.
Tom Violet, please comment on the recent hack of Colonial Pipeline.
Yeah. So the government, I think, is saying that it was Russian. The first report I heard was that it was Indian hackers. Now they're saying it's Russian. I've got a friend at the FBI who says that they're pretty confident that it's not Russian government. It's, probably a handful of guys in their parents' basements or whatever. But this is bad, right? This is bad, where a couple of hackers could shut down the East Coast's major main pipeline, and essentially cut off the supply chain of gasoline to a half a dozen states along the East Coast. But this comes back to the notion of what NSA should be doing. Why didn't NSA protect us from this? Right? They're supposed to be the geniuses in this realm. Where was NSA? I'll tell you where NSA was. They were busy reading your emails and my emails and listening to our phone calls and trying to decide who's un-American or less American than the next guy. But this is exactly what NSA is supposed to be doing, protecting us from electronic enemies. And they dropped the ball.
Well, we've come upon our hour. I don't see any more questions popping up.
Excellent.
So I really appreciate you coming on, John.
Howie, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure. I've been a big fan of yours for a long time, so I was very happy to do it. Thanks for having me.
Likewise, I've been following your case for a decade now, and
thank you.
This whistleblower issue is so important. And, we don't have an administration now any more than under Trump.
No.
That is going to deal with it. I mean,
no.
The prosecutions of Julian Assange and Daniel Hale are going forward.
This is bipartisan. Biden is just as bad as Trump, and Trump was just as bad as Obama. And may I say one last thing? Sure. There's a very important whistleblower out there right now by the name of Daniel Hale. Dan is the drone whistleblower who went public with the fact that we were murdering civilians, women, children, the elderly, in our drone program. He was scooped up by the Justice Department last week, and he's incarcerated right now at a federal holding facility in Alexandria, Virginia, of course, the Eastern District of Virginia. And the poor guy is terrified. He's on suicide watch right now. I posted on Facebook and on Twitter his address. So, if you've got 5 minutes, send him a letter, send him a postcard, just tell him that he's not forgotten. He's really going through some dark days right now.
Yeah, I hope everybody will take a minute to do that.
Thank you.
So I don't have any closing comments. You're going to be on a podcast with Jesselyn Radak, who's a whistleblower herself and a lawyer for whistleblowers.
Yes.
Next week. You want to tell people when that's happening?
Sure. Actually, let me look at my calendar on my phone. Jesselyn Radak, I mentioned a few minutes ago, was one of my attorneys, one of my 11 attorneys. And she is an absolute genius when it comes to these whistleblower issues. She's a whistleblower herself. She blew the whistle on the fact that the Justice Department had denied access to an attorney for John Walker Lind, who was known as the American Taliban. That's going to be at 12 noon Eastern. Go to Covert Action Magazine's website, 12 noon Eastern on Tuesday, May 18th.
Okay, good. So if people didn't get enough of you tonight, they can get more next week.
Jesselyn's more interesting than I am. And so is Tom Drake.
Yeah, Tom Drake was one of the first to be prosecuted. And
yes,
he's a hero too.
He is. Thank you.
So that's it. We're going to move our live streams to Saturday at 3 p.m. starting this Saturday, because my running mate Angela Walker's driving that dump truck, and they've got her working 14 hours a day with construction season up. So she hasn't been able to make these Tuesday nights. So, check us out on Facebook and Twitter. We'll be here at 3 o'clock on Saturday, and hope everybody can join us. So have a good evening, everybody.